Okay, so welcome back. Today we're gonna continue speaking about the passive voice. Okay, in the last two videos we were speaking about how it works, what does it mean, when do you use it, and how to make it, how to use it. Right now we're gonna be speaking a little bit more about it. So we're gonna try and give you some examples in every time tense that we have checked before. We're going to be checking every time tense and how to use the passive voice. We're going to do an example with the simple present, the simple past, the simple future, and all of them. So you know, this way you're going to see how everything is always the same. So it says, the structure continues to be the same as always. So this is super important. The structure continues to be the same as always. We have subject, auxiliary verb, and the complement is optional. Okay? In the active voice, what does it say? In this case, in the active voice, in this case, we are using the simple present. So the auxiliary is not there given the fact that it is an affirmative statement. But we just follow the rules of any time tense. Okay? In the simple present, remember the auxiliary is not mandatory in affirmative statements. And in the simple past, we don't use the auxiliary in affirmative statements. That is the problem with the simple present and the simple past. The rest of the time tenses, the auxiliary is going to be mandatory, okay? In the passive voice, we always need subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement, like the active voice is the same. But the difference is that the subject is not the doer of the action. The subject is the receiver of the action, okay? The verb, the auxiliary, is always the verb to be. And it is conjugated in the present, in the past, in the future, in any time tense that you want. And the verb is always in the past participle. So this is something that we're gonna be doing. It is really important that we remember that part, okay? So let's check. Sorry. Let's check this. In the simple tenses, we need the auxiliaries. The simple present, I hope that you remember, the auxiliary of the simple present is do or does. The auxiliary of the simple past is did. And the auxiliary of the future is will. So these are the auxiliaries that we are going to be using for the simple forms. So what do we have? We have, again, subject. In the active voice, the subject is the doer of the action. Daniel or he, yeah? If we want to say Daniel, okay, Daniel. If we want to use a pronoun, remember, we need personal pronouns to replace subjects. So we have the subject. The subject is Daniel, he, or whatever. The auxiliary. The auxiliary on the simple present is do or does. In the case of Daniel, Daniel does or he does. The problem is that we never use the auxiliaries on the simple present. We never use the auxiliary. And what happens if we don't use the auxiliary? What happens is that the verb, this is the verb, paint, the verb has to take this S. Thus, have an S right here. If you don't have this S, the verb has to take it. So subject, auxiliary, if we don't have the auxiliary, the verb takes the S. And then we have the complement, which is in this case, an object, a person that is receiving the action of being painted. This person is the object, we can replace it with her. People who are the object can be replaced with object pronouns, not personal pronouns. So her, not she. He, not him. He because he's the subject, her because she's the object. This is the simple present. Subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. That's pretty much it. But what happened in the passive voice? In the passive voice, we need again a subject, but the subject is not going to be the doer of the action. It's going to be the receiver of the action. The receiver of the action is Paula. Do you remember? She is the one receiving the paint. So in the passive voice, she's the subject. Because Paula is the subject, when we want to replace her with a personal pronoun, meaning with a pronoun, we need the personal pronoun. She, not her. We're not gonna use her, we're gonna use she. Yes, because she's the subject. So we change that part. Then we need the auxiliary. The auxiliary for the passive voice is always the verb to be. The verb to be in the present is, the verb to be in the present is. Remember that the verb to be in the present is, are, or am. In the case of the third person, she is. Remember also that the verb is always, always, always in the past participle. Painted and painted. This is the past participle. And finally, this is optional. If you want to use an object, if you want to use a complement, you can say a complement of time, a complement of place, or even you can name the doer of the action. Yeah, Daniel used to be in the active voice. Daniel was the subject. In the passive voice, Daniel is the complement. And because he is the complement, you replace it with an object pronoun. It's not he, like he was here. It is now him. Yeah, does it make sense? So Paula is painted by Daniel, or she is painted by him. Daniel painted Paula, or he painted her. Daniel paints Paula, or he paints her. These two sentences, they are the same. In the active voice, remember, in the active voice, when we have active voice, the subject is the doer of the action. When we have the passive voice, the subject is the receiver of the action. This is the most important part. This is the only difference, okay? This is very simple. This is in the simple present. Then let's do the same thing, but in the simple past. How do we change this to the simple past? In the simple past, well, active voice, the doer of the action is again, I didn't change this part. Okay, the doer of the action is the subject. So the doer of the action is Daniel. If you don't want to say Daniel, you say he. It is the same person, okay? Then the auxiliary. The auxiliary for the simple present is did. Yes, did and did. The problem is that because this is an affirmative statement, we normally never use the auxiliary. What happens when you don't use the auxiliary? Well, if you don't use the auxiliary, the verb, this is the verb, the same thing happens, okay? The verb has to take the past. The verb is in the past because we don't have an auxiliary. So Daniel painted, he painted. And then the object or the complement will be Paula. She is the receiver of the action. Because she is the receiver, if you want to change Paula for a pronoun, you need an object pronoun, her. Daniel painted Paula, he painted her. This is the active voice. In the active voice, we are focusing on the doer of the action. The subject is the person that did the action. What happens in the passive voice? In the passive voice, the subject is not the person painting, is the person receiving the paint, okay? If you're receiving the paint, then you are the subject. The subject is she or Paula. Paula used to be her, but now is she because she's the subject, okay? Then what happens? You need the auxiliary. The auxiliary is going to be the verb to be, but the verb to be in past. If this is in the present, the sentence is in the present. If this is in the past, the sentence is in past. The verb to be in the past has two possibilities. It can be was or were. The third person of the singular, she, was. And remember also that the verb is always, always, always in the past participle. It is always in the past participle. Participle. It is always going to be past participle. If you want to use a complement, you can add a complement of time, a complement of place, a complement of way or mode, or you can add the agent. The agent is the one that is the doer of the action, is the person that used to be the subject. Daniel was the subject in the active voice. In the passive voice, he is the complement. Because of that, we don't replace it with he. He is when he is the subject. When he is the complement, we replace it with him. Paula was painted by Daniel. She was painted by him. Okay? So, he painted her and she was painted by him. They are exactly the same sentence. In this case, we are focusing on the doer of the action. In this case, we are focusing on the receiver of the action. That is the only difference. These two time tenses are probably the two most difficult ones because, as you remember, do, does, and did, this auxiliary, normally you don't use it in affirmative, but it is important to use it in negative. It is important to make questions. The verb in the future, well, The other 10 tenses, we have the simple present and the simple past. Simple present and the simple past. And we have 10 more time tenses. The other 10 time tenses, the auxiliary is mandatory always. So these are the two most difficult ones, again. So let's check. Let's check the simple future. In the simple future, in the active voice, the subject is the doer of the action. The subject is Daniel. The subject is he. Because Daniel is a man, and this is the third person, if you want to replace him with a pronoun, you need a personal pronoun, he. Then you need the auxiliary. Even though this is affirmative, in the future, the auxiliary is always necessary, always mandatory, will, okay? Then you need a verb. For example, you have the verb paint. Remember that with will, the verb is always in the base form. After will is a modal verb, an auxiliary. After will, the verbs are always in the base form. Paint. And finally, we need a complement. In this case, this is an object. It is the person. Yeah, this is the complement right here. The complement is the person receiving the action of the verb. Daniel will paint Paula, or he will paint her. He is substituting the subject, and her is substituting the object. Okay? What happens when we want to do this in the passive voice? The subject is not the doer of the action. The subject is the receiver of the action. So the subject is Paula, the person that received the action. This person received the action. Now she is the subject. If we want to replace her with a pronoun, we use she because she is the subject. Okay? Then we need an auxiliary. The auxiliary is the verb to be. The verb to be in the present, the verb to be in the past, the verb to be in the future. The future of the verb to be is will be. Yeah, that's kind of complicated, kind of weird. But the future of be, we don't have a conjugation for the future with the verb to be. The only thing that we have to do is use will be. Then the verb is always going to be in the past participle every single time. And if we need a complement, we can use, for example, the agent. The agent is the person that was the doer of the action. In the passive voice, in the active voice, Daniel was the doer of the action. He was the subject. In the passive voice, Daniel is the receiver of the action. So when we replace Daniel, we don't replace it with he. We replace it with him because he is the object, or well, the complement, not the subject. Okay? Now, this is what we were checking. You need subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. And we have them, subject, auxiliary, verb, and complement. Well, except the simple present, except the simple present and the simple past. These two time tenses in affirmative statements, when they are affirmative, they normally never use the auxiliary, okay? But the rest of them is mandatory. Now, how do you think that you can make a sentence negative? The auxiliary takes the negative. So, thus, let me just erase this. Thus and did, they become mandatory. They become, it is an obligation to use them, right? So what do we do? We use the auxiliary. The auxiliary is going to be in the present, thus. In the past, did. And the auxiliary takes the negative. So, doesn't or didn't. Super simple, okay? In the case of the future, will changes to won't. Daniel won't paint Paula. Daniel didn't paint Paula. Daniel doesn't paint Paula. What happens in the passive voice? In the passive voice, the auxiliary takes the negative. The auxiliary is the verb to be. So, Paula isn't painted. She isn't painted. Paula wasn't painted. She wasn't painted. And will be, remember that when you have two parts on the auxiliary, only the first part takes the negative. Only the first part will take the negative. So the only thing that you have to do is, instead of using will, you're not going to use will, you're going to use won't. Paula won't be painted, she won't be painted. And that's it. It is the same. The auxiliary takes the negative. Do you remember how to make a question? Yeah? What happens with the auxiliary? The auxiliary changes positions with the subject. The subject moves after the auxiliary and the auxiliary before the subject. So how do we make a question in the simple present? Sorry. Yeah, in the simple present. Very simple. This, sorry, let me just do it again. This auxiliary that wasn't here, this auxiliary is going to become mandatory because the auxiliary is thus, or thus, or did, is going to change positions. This one and this one, they are going to switch positions with the subject. Is first auxiliary and then subject. So we have, does Daniel paint Paula? Does he paint Paula? When we have thus, when we have the auxiliary, because the auxiliary is mandatory, if we have the auxiliary, that means that we don't really need to use the S. The S is here. We have the S, thus, so we don't really need the S here. Thus Daniel, in negatives is the same. Daniel doesn't paint. Does Daniel paint Paula? Does he paint her? Did Daniel, again, in this case it is the same thing, because we have the auxiliary, we don't need the verb to be in the past. Did Daniel paint Paula? Remember, when we have the auxiliary is telling past, so we don't have to change the verb. Did Daniel paint Paula? Did he paint her? That's it. If you want to make a question with the other one, with this, is will, you need to use will. And will is going to switch positions with the subject. First the auxiliary and then the subject. First the auxiliary and then the subject. Will Daniel paint Paula? Will he paint her? That's pretty much it. How do you make it? How do you make it? Let me just erase all of this. How do you make this in the passive voice? Again, very, very simple. Your auxiliary is the verb to be. Yes, your auxiliary is this. Your auxiliary is going to switch positions with the subject. So instead of saying Paula is painted, you say, is Paula painted? You switch the auxiliary and the subject. They switch positions. Is she painted by him? Yes or no? In the simple past, was Paula painted by Daniel? Was she painted by him? This is a question. Yeah? In the future, remember that you have two parts. You have will and you have be. When that happens, only the first part takes the negative and only the first part switches positions. So you say, will Paula be painted? Will Paula be painted? Or you can say, will she be painted by him? These are questions, okay? When you have two words as the auxiliary, one word stays here and the other one switches positions with the subject, like we always knew. So this is the simple present, the simple past, and the simple future in the passive voice, okay? Again, we are following the same rules. These sentences, they mean the same. They are pretty much the same thing. The problem is, well, they are a little bit more complex because we need to pay attention to the rules, okay? So let's check something else. Let me check. I think we need to make a little break. I'm going to break this video. I'm going to stop here. And in the next presentation, I will check, we're gonna check the continuous time tenses. Today, well, right now in this video, we are only checking, let me just highlight this. We are checking the simple tenses. The simple present, the simple past, and the simple future. In the next video, we're gonna be checking the continuous tenses. In the third video, the perfect tenses. In the final video, the perfect continuous tenses. I don't wanna make them all in one video because it's going to be like 2 hours long or something like that. And I don't know, it's gonna be more difficult to upload to YouTube, and it's probably going to be more difficult for you to pay attention to the whole video. So this way you can make pauses, you can just keep your rhythm, okay? So thank you very much. I will see you on the next video. We're gonna continue speaking about the passive voice. Any questions, anything that you don't understand about this, you can let me know. And don't worry about this presentation. I will send it to you through the group that we have. We're gonna find a way so that you can have it and you can study it, okay? So thank you very much again. And well, I'll see you soon. Bye.